This
let's get
conference
started.
will now be recorded.
Fine. So, see, until now, we have been looking at what really Azure Cloud is, and we've been talking about different services on the Azure Cloud, and we've been dealing with different things on the Azure Cloud, like the IaaS services, the PaaS services, and all that stuff. And what we've been doing at the end of the day is like taking a Visual Studio and taking our code, doing a publish and all that stuff, right? Now, I I'm okay with this process. I'm okay with this process, as in creating the project and building the project, that is converting the project, let's say, from the high level language to a low level language and all that stuff. But it would be great if I can automate this out. It would be great if I can version control this. It would be great if I can test it out and only then promote the code to my user. Meaning, it would be really great if I can manage the life cycle of my code and manage the life cycle of my, or manage the way my project is actually working. Meaning, what am I exactly talking about? For which I will need to tell how exactly a team really works. We need to understand how exactly a team really works, and to understand that, we need to understand how a team is really composed of. Like when you talk about a software development, how are teams really composed of and what do they do? For which, let's talk about the team size as such, or basically what the team, what basically the composition of a team is such. So let's say you have the very beginning of everything, you have a business who basically has a need. Let's say this is a client who's coming to, let's say, your company is XYZ Software Solutions, and this company wants a software called Ola. They say, hey, I want a software called Ola. I want your help to design it out. So please design this. And they approach your company called XYZ Software Solutions.co.com or something like that. And to listen to this particular customer, to listen to what he's actually saying, you need someone basically who basically can listen to him. Okay. This particular someone is for me called a product owner. This particular someone is called a product owner. This product owner basically will now basically listen to the client continuously, and he will involve another team called a business team, who will now basically say, what, we also have another team here, which is the business team, and these guys basically send out a few technical people out there to the customer. And this process, the entire first process, is called as a requirement capturing. This phase, right, the entire phase is called a requirement capturing phase. Requirement capture, meaning now the technical team will go to the client and now they try to understand that, what, how can the UI be looking at, what color is the UI of your application, how fast your UI should be, or basically who is your application intended to, like which business sector or which consumer sector your business is really intended to. If it's intended to, let's say, a particular company, is it like, are you having plans to expand your business? Fine, all this is like the preliminary things, which is like a bit non-technical. Going to technically, understanding things out, they'll now start understanding, okay, fine, in which language should your application be developed into? Java, Python, .NET, C sharp, what your application or how your application needs to be developed as such. This is the first phase, something called as a requirement capturing as such. Now, earlier, what used to happen is that the requirement capturing, yes, it was done great. Product owner was there, under whom there was a team operating, who's a team of developers. Under the product owner, you had a team of developers out here. Like all these guys are like developers out here. And then you used to have someone like a QA. So here we'll just put them as developers. Here you have someone like a QA. Now what used to happen is that the product owner used to send across the requirement to, let's say, this particular team called developers. They would say, hey, you know what, this is the cloud that we're using. This is, let's say, the technology that we're using. Now please go ahead and start, developing the application. So they used to do what they used to, kind of start developing the application. They used to complete the application development in like about 2 or 3 months or so, and then send it out to, let's say, something like a QA team. So the application is now being passed on to the QA team. The QA would now basically go ahead, test out the application, identify bugs, identify vulnerabilities in your application, and then come back to your development team and say, hey, you know what, uh, the application has so many bugs. Can you resolve this out? Can you basically redo your application? I see basically this to be a fault and that to be a fault and all that stuff. The QA will basically send the application out again or push back on the development team. The development team will pick up from what the QA basically has said, all all the improvements and all that stuff, and they will develop it and then again send it back to the QA and all that stuff. So it used to be a back and forth mechanism where the developers were pushing it back to the QA, QA was pushing it back to the developers. Because one issue here is that the QA might be using a machine with a different configuration, the developer might be using a machine with a different configuration. It happens the same way. Like it happened between me and Akila today. That in my basically in my machine, my code was working, but in Akila's machine, the code wasn't working because she did not have a particular NuGet package installed and she had to do a couple of things out there. Same thing happens even in an organization. QAs might not have the same configuration as the developers might, and the developers might not have the same configuration as the QAs might. So there would be a huge tug of war basically that is going around between both of the teams. Always this is like an issue basically the industry is trying to resolve. And this is where your time frame of the application delivery kind of increases. The time frame that you promised, let's say, was about 6 months, but the development team itself took about the first 2 or 3 months basically, and they pass it on to QA. QA took about 1 month and then pass it on to the developers. This itself is like taking a lot of time for the application. Now this is called a waterfall model because you see it like a waterfall, right? The product owner is giving here, the developers are giving to the QA is again pushing back. This is known as a waterfall model right now. Now increasingly, or rather right now, if you take my opinion, there is no organization who's following this model at all. There is no organization in any part of the world who's following this or who's following this pattern at all. This is slightly changed, and the industry is now highly realizing something known as feature oriented development or feature developments. Now the same set of users, one being the customer, the other being right now not one product owner but multiple product owners, or let's say I put one product owner out here, one who just listens to the business, product owners. Now you have a business team which basically does all the requirement capturing, all that stuff, but this product owner has someone known as scrum masters. Now I introduce you to someone known as a scrum master. These are a whole set of scrum masters, and what will the product owner do is that the product owner will sell in, you know what, this is an Ola application, let's work on one or two features of the application. Let's say the application wants, the first and very thing it wants is what? A facility to book cabs. So let's work on a feature which is called a cab booking. And this product owner will now divide the feature. Now here I am talking about one feature out here. So product owner has what? He has a feature called cab booking. Cab bookings again can be what? Mini, micro, nano, all these stuff, right? The product owner will now divide the feature and send it across to the scrum masters, meaning four different scrum masters are representing four different development teams out here. Four different development teams out here working together, but on features. Each and every team gets one feature. Let's say this one got nano, this one got mini, micro, sedan, something like that. Meaning all the buttons you see there on the application is being driven by different teams out here. The Scrum Master will further divide the feature into something known as a user story. Features are further divided into something known as something called as a user story. These user stories are now given to developers. Not one but multiple. Each and every team basically can have multiple developers out here. Same year, and same year. Each and every development team will now work on a user story, and each and every development team works in a 2 to 3 week cycle to develop a user story. This 2 to 3 week cycle is now called a sprint. Each and every team out there is now working in something known as sprint, meaning now let's see, the advantage of it is that I have a good division of work and now I have an efficient development of my work. Meaning each and every team is working on different features out there. Each and every team basically is like, working on different features as such, and they're working together because each and every feature is dependent upon other. Each and every feature basically is dependent upon the other feature, and they are delivering it not in the form of a product but in the form of a feature, and they are releasing your product in the form of a feature. Because the first time when I used Ola, I only had one option called book your cab. I did not have sedan and all that stuff, and then basically sedan and everything came with the following updates, and now you have like Ola food booking and a lot of things basically that have also come into it. So meaning you're not trying to deliver the entire product at one go. You're trying to divide your product into multiple things and then divide and then basically deliver it in an estimated time frame. 14-15 days, one feature, very good. Release it out to the customer, very good, great. Again 14-15 days, release something. So you are getting regular updates out here. You are now getting regular updates out here, and you are making sure to, let's say, give the customer like a chunk of feature at a given work time, like at a given time frame. Now a product owner, like you have a product owner for each and every team also, like on top of a scrum master you'll also have a product owner who's basically reporting to the main product owner as such. Now a product owner, a scrum master, the developers, the QAs inside that team, the QAs basically inside that team, basically all these together are called an agile team. Now I'm talking about an agile team. I'm talking about one team out here. This is an agile team. 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 Everything has the same amount of composition. A product owner, a scrum master, developers, QAs, and all that stuff. All these four together are now called as what? An agile team. Now this agile team, right? I mean, each and every agile team needs to work with the other one because everyone is dependent upon each other. So I club together a dependent. I mean, I club together all the teams which are dependent upon each other, which can have a capability to work with each other, and I together call them as an agile release train. Four different agile teams together, I club them, and I now call them as what? An agile release train. And you have someone called as a release train manager to manage the entire agile release train as such. And this entire agile release train will work under a standard definition of a 2 or 3 week sprint to deliver one particular feature. And they are breaking the feature down into what? User stories. So features, user stories, teams, and the teams are working in like a close sync with each other, like a close coordination with each other to develop features and deliver it out there to, let's say, your customer. This is now the agile development methodology. From a waterfall model which was static, now you have moved to something known as an agile development methodology. You're following a particular pattern, and most importantly, you're following something known as a testing oriented development, meaning you are now not developing things in, let's say, 6 month cycle or 3 month cycle. Rather, you're doing it in a 10-day or a 14-day cycle. Here, what's happening is that since your stories are small, you're not developing an entire feature. You're developing a story. You're developing a user story. Since the story is small, as and when the story is being developed, you will involve the QA into it. As and when your story is being developed, you'll involve the QA into it. You'll make sure that the QA can test it right out there and make sure that this testing is also automated. So you're involving your QAs, meaning you are doing a testing oriented development as such. This is how the teams have evolved right now. So guys, any questions with this until here? So again, we have a product owner, scrum master, who will basically organize your entire team, users, meaning the developers,
Who will
QAs,
divide the features?
the scrum master. Scrum master is going to be basically responsible to divide the feature and then assign the user stories to the developers. So your feature division is coming here. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, fine. Now
Yeah.
this is, yeah. Go
That,
ahead, please.
this means entire team is developing the product, but each team is
Hmm.
working on the respective features. Right?
Exactly. Entire team is developing the product, but each and every team is working on one specific feature, and they're working in close sync with each other so that they can deliver the entire product as such, or they can deliver an entire feature as such. Any more questions, guys, in this particular model? Okay, fine. I have developed it, but where will I test it? Like each and every team is now having this problem that what, I have like developed this out and I now want to test this application out. Then how will I test it? Where will I test it? And by development, do you also mean that I will write the code and I will basically convert my code also? If I will convert my code, then that's going to be an issue because this is the first increment of my code. I wrote it, I converted it, and I'm right now giving it to the QA. QA is testing it out, great. But this converted format, now this is the first time I converted it. The second time I made some changes to the app.json file, I again need to convert it. Third time I did something else to, let's say, the SQL app project, I again need to convert it. Meaning I did a lot of things out here and now I am converting all these things out. I need to convert it each and every time basically when I do some change out here. So is there a way that I can just focus upon the development, and the conversion and all is taken care by another team. And the release of the, I mean, the release of the application is also taken care by another team. Yes, certainly yes. That's where we come into picture, which is DevOps. Now we are a team who's responsible to basically make sure to reduce the friction between the project development and the project delivery. Meaning, I basically am a user, or I basically, my role basically comes into the play between a developer and the operations. Operations is my business, developer is my developer, and the two term together combined is called DevOps. Developer plus operation, developments plus operations. Meaning, what I right now do is that the work of a developer gets completed when he, what do you say, he develops the product. That's it. Like when he writes the code, his work is done. My work starts after the developer writes the code. After the developer writes the code, my work starts from there. Meaning, I now want to make sure that this code is put in like a central location, like somewhere not in the developer's machine. Because if, let's say, the developer's machine crashes, or let's say the developer leaves the organization tomorrow, then where will I get that code from? So the first thing that I'm really concerned about is the management of my code. Management of code, or code management. Second thing I'm concerned about is called as versioning of my code. Meaning, now I'm working on a code version called version 1. It is working fine. I want to release the version 2. Version 2 basically failed. How will I get my version 1? Do I have a history of my versions, or am I doing a version controlling? This is called version controlling. Version control. Meaning, how am I maintaining the history of all the versions basically of the code basically that is sent across to me? Both the questions are answered by something known as a repository. This is where repository comes into picture. Can be Git, can be Azure repos. Repository is a place on the cloud where my code can sit, or where I can basically put my code in. Great. I now have a repository. The next thing that I want to do is the code is still in a raw format. The developer hasn't converted it. It's not his job right now. It is my job. Will I download the code, then convert it, then upload it? You can do it, but again, that's a manual procedure. Is there a way to automate it? Yes. The process of conversion, as and when the developer checks in the code into the repository, as and when the developer uploads the code into the repository, is called a process of a continuous integration. Continuous integration, for which I need to use something known as a pipeline. This is known as a continuous integration pipeline. For this, I have like various tools like Jenkins, Maven, MS Build, and in my case, Azure DevOps, which is, let's say, helping me convert my code from a raw language to, let's say, convert my code from a high level language to, let's say, a binary or a DLL. After I convert the code into a DLL, I am calling it as an artifact. I'm not calling it anymore as a DLL or nothing but like that. I'm calling all my binaries together as something known as an artifact. Now I want to store my artifact somewhere. This is called the storing of your artifact needs a version control as well. This is known as Artifactory. Artifactories out there in the market, you have like a lot of Artifactory repositories out there like JFrog, like Nexus, Azure Artifactory, and a lot of stuff. All these are the artifacts storing locations. Everything else is like everything basically that you see out here is an artifact storing location. Now, very importantly, how do I manage the life cycle of my code? This is known as a process of delivery. I have the code, the developer has given me the code. I have converted my code into artifacts using something known as a continuous integration pipeline. Now, how do I test this out? With what do I test this out? Now, this application, imagine being a cloud application. I now want to leverage a cloud like Azure. I now want to leverage a cloud like Azure, and I now want to define something known as an environment. What do I mean by an environment out here? Environment are nothing or basically is nothing but stages in your development of the code. You might have environments like dev, you might have environments like QA or testing. You might have environments like production. Sorry, you might have environment like stages or pre-production. And you might have environment or you will have environment like production. And when they say that the code hits production, it means that the code is released to the customer. This is where your customer is actually coming or the users are actually coming. If code is going to the production, this means that you are releasing the code to the user. You are giving the code back to the user, meaning you are giving the application to the user. This is my code lifecycle. I want my code to first be deployed in development environment, be thoroughly tested out there. I want my code to be basically deployed in staging QA environment, be thoroughly tested out there, and then promoted to staging, tested here, then going to production. Now, in terms of Azure, if I talk about Azure, each and every environment as such is a resource group. Meaning when I say I'm deploying my code to, let's say, development, I am deploying my code to a web app or an IIS server that is sitting in a resource group called development resource group. When I am deploying my code to, let's say, the QA, I am deploying on top of a web app which is sitting in a resource group called QA. When I'm deploying to stage, same thing, and when I'm deploying to production, it's the same thing out here. But this is a protected resource group. The changes to this resource group as are not directly promoted, rather they are firstly deployed into the code is firstly deployed into a web application, let's say sitting on the development resource group, tested here thoroughly, made sure it is tested here thoroughly by the developers, and once the technical lead of the development team feels it's okay, they'll push the code into QA, meaning the code will now get deployed into the QA environment, being tested thoroughly by all the quality analysts out there, and then deployed into staging. This is where your company's business team comes into picture, tests it out completely, and then promotes the code to, let's say, the final web application, which is the production. This might be a web application IIS server and etc. And one resource group might hold a combination of resources, like let's say this needs a backend SQL server. You will have a development backend SQL server. This needs a storage account. You will have a development storage account. This needs a QA storage account or QA SQL server. And then finally a production SQL server, a production storage account as such. Meaning I'm not talking about one resource, I'm talking about a combination of resources. And all this, right, that is sitting in the backend is called as my backend infrastructure. And let's say my backend infrastructure is using web apps, SQL servers, storage accounts, IIS servers, and all that stuff, a combination of all that stuff. Traffic managers, load balancers, all these things out. Who is going to create it? Who is going to manage it? It's we guys who are the DevOps engineers. Now I need a mechanism to automate the infrastructure creation also, for which I have something known as ARM templates or Terraform or PowerShell. Can I use that particular service in a combination with Azure DevOps? Yes, you can do that, which is called an infra release. You are managing your backend infrastructure, you are version controlling your backend infrastructure, you are making sure your backend infrastructure also has an Artifactory, and then you are deploying it to development, testing it out there, deploying it to QA, testing it out there, staging, and then finally promoting it out there to the production environment. This entire thing is called a continuous deployment or a continuous delivery. And this can be achieved again by different tools. And for continuous delivery, especially, or continuous deployment, especially, you have things like, if I talk about the open source world, you have things like Octopus, which is a continuous deployment server. You have Ansible, which is a configuration management and a deployment server. And in our case, Azure DevOps can also be used for continuous deployment and continuous delivery. Now, Azure DevOps is a complete package of everything. You can have a repository. You have a repository in Azure DevOps. You have something known as Azure boards, which will help you break down your features into user stories. You have CI pipelines in Azure DevOps, which will help you convert the code into, let's say, an artifact. You have an Artifactory in Azure DevOps. You have a release pipeline in Azure DevOps as well. So you can manage everything using one particular portal, which is called as dev.azure.com. It's called as dev.azure.com. Like, this is a one-stop solution for all the things out there. And if you have an Azure account and already signed into an Azure account, you can use the same Azure account to also sign into DevOps. So let's say if I sign into DevOps, it'll now ask me what are the accounts and all that stuff. And since I'm already logged in, let's say with Azure, it now said, this is the account. I don't find something known as an Azure DevOps organization. The first thing that I am actually want to create, the first thing that I'm actually creating out here is known as a DevOps organization. Organization is an equivalent to subscription in Azure. Organization is an equivalent of a subscription in Azure, guys. So I need an organization. So it's asking me, okay, fine, your name and all that stuff. I'll say continue. And after that, it's now asking me, where do you want to host all your projects, or how do you want your organization to really look at? I'll say, okay, fine, great. I'll get started with Azure DevOps. Say continue. Now it's saying, you know what? This is the name of your organization. I'll say, this is my first organization. See, all the names already taken. 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's see. 0406. Okay, the name exists. And it's telling, you know what, after you create an organization, you definitely want to create projects inside it. Where do you want to host your projects? You can take a location like India, anywhere, it's okay. And you can say, give this particular code out here. And now it's telling, you know what, I'll create an organization and now I'll take you to that particular organization as such. The first thing that you actually want to go ahead and create is something known as a DevOps organization. And this is how it really looks like. This is the name of your organization. You have something known as organization settings. And now it's asking you that, you know what, do you want to go ahead and create a project of your own? I'll say, yes, it's a test project, something like this, and we'll create this out. And this is what I was talking about. You have repositories, you have pipelines, you have Artifactory, everything that is built inside your Azure DevOps project. And you can now do all these things out here. Repository, CI, Artifactory, CD, everything within a project. Let's imagine this is not test project, this is Ola project. This is your organization who's trying to build an Ola project using a tool or basically a technology called as an Azure DevOps. This is, let's say, the front end of Azure DevOps, guys. And this is, let's say, the release methodology I am trying to look at. So I have a repository, a CI pipeline, then I have, let's say, the release mechanism that I'm actually looking at. And then you have like approvers and all that stuff which gets built into your project. Your project can be as simple as it is or as complicated as it is. So we'll start with a very, very, very simple project on how to, get started and all that stuff. And we'll take it to as complex as something like infrastructure as code, pipelines, builds, releases, and all that stuff. So this is what we are actually going to get into. And this was a very, very, very high level introduction of how we were, how we are today, where we sit in, and what do we do. Like, what kind of a tool is it in? What do we do and all that stuff. And Azure DevOps is a different thing altogether, meaning this is a software as a service having a different domain name like dev.azure.com, and this is a software as a service which is portal.azure.com. Two separate things, but you can integrate Azure with Azure DevOps very well. Like I have the same ID for Azure, I can have the same ID for Azure DevOps, and the integration works very well. And let's say there are a few organizations who do not want to go for Azure DevOps, then how will they manage all these things out? They will manage it in a bit different way. Like for version controlling their code, they might be using something like Git. To convert their code into, let's say, from raw to, let's say, so from high level language to, let's say, raw binaries, they might be using something like Jenkins, which is a very popular CI tool, open source. To store all their artifacts, they might be using something like JFrog or Nexus. To push their code into, let's say, a cloud, they need a continuous deployment tool, right? They might be using something like Octopus or Team City, whatever it is. You have like a lot of things out there like Buddy Build, Nevercode, Team City, Octopus, and all that stuff. And finally, a cloud. Finally, a cloud out here, which in my case might be Azure, AWS, or GCP. A combination of open source is also possible out here. This is like DevOps. Like when you talk about DevOps, people are like, what do you know, Chef, do you know Puppet, do you know Ansible? You don't need to know all that stuff because you are an Azure DevOps engineer. You're using Azure DevOps to maintain all these things out. But we'll also be looking at, let's say, a case for open source. We will also be covering Jenkins, Octopus, and then deployment into Azure. We'll also be looking at that particular project. But we'll be heavily focusing upon Azure DevOps as such because this is going to be your bread and butter. This is going to be the primary thing that you'll be working on. Azure, yes, for managing your infrastructure, for maintaining your infrastructure. DevOps, yes, to maintain your projects, to maintain the entire code delivery or the entire code development lifecycle. And this entire thing, from the very scratch of it to the very end of it, the entire thing is in a nutshell called as a SDLC, software development lifecycle. It's all called as SDLC or software development lifecycle. And the maintenance, the management, the configuration of all these things is the primary role of a DevOps engineer. Maintenance of the code, maintenance of the life cycle of the entire project, maintenance of the security, all these together clubbed would give us, or maintenance of the infrastructure, even that one very importantly. All these together clubbed are the primary role where we come into picture. So until now, what we've been doing, we've been maintaining the infrastructure. We've been creating the infrastructure using Azure Portal, and we've been doing, let's say, ARM templates from our local machines, but we'll not do that anymore. We'll try to leverage Azure DevOps for everything that we try to create out there. We'll try to leverage Azure DevOps services for even storing our files. And there are different terminologies out here that I need to basically tell you all. So tomorrow is something, or yeah, from tomorrow we'll be starting with Azure repos, and we'll be looking at the different kind of repositories out there. And firstly, we'll be understanding what a repository really is, and then we will move into something like CI pipeline, artifacts, CD pipeline, environments, approvals, infrastructure as a code, and a lot of things as such. And very importantly, how do you manage a service like Azure DevOps? Now, the beauty of it is that if you understand one particular service in and out, the other services are a replica. Now, one thing I've noticed about Microsoft is that earlier, to which you had Jenkins, you had JFrog, Octopus, and all. These were like very very famous out there. Azure DevOps or Azure or Microsoft just borrowed the idea from, let's say, different tools that are readily available in the market, club them together, and gave a product called Azure DevOps. Like this is now called as Azure DevOps. A lot of people, like there are like different terminologies a lot of people use for this one. Like it began in 2012, if I remember right. It began in 2012 as something called as VSO, Visual Studio Online. So the first thing it came out as something known as Visual Studio Online. It's called VSO, and later in 14 or 15, I think, it got converted into something known as VSTS, Visual Studio Team Server. So you find a lot of people even talking about, even today they mention Azure DevOps as VSTS. And then later in 16 or 17, I believe, they changed it into something known as Azure DevOps. Into something known as an Azure DevOps. And a lot of people also refer this product to as ADO. ADO, Azure DevOps, the same thing. So VSO, VSTS, and then now Azure DevOps is such. Like anything they refer is the same thing. It's Azure DevOps or ADO, and they refer to, let's say, the same thing as such. It's a licensed product by Microsoft. Right now, I am working on a basic license, a free licensing basically that is given out there. I can add like about 5 users out there. This is like the license basically that I do have. It's a basic license, a free license basically that I'm working on. And you can basically also purchase licenses like the way you purchase Azure subscription, like pay as you go and all that stuff, right? So Azure DevOps licenses. So you have an Azure DevOps pricing calculator out here. You have two different models out here. One known as Azure DevOps Services and the other one was Azure DevOps Server. We'll talk about what server really is. But right now, this is like a free and you get, all that stuff. And you have kind of licenses like basic plan for 5 users, about, then 432 per a month per user. And then you have basic plus test plan. So they offer a lot of things out there. So a lot of different licenses are available out there. The main difference between Azure DevOps and let's say an open source is that open sources are free. Like Jenkins, you do not have a license. I think JFrog has a license. Nexus has a license for Artifactory. Octopus 2 has a license, but the initial version of it is free, like Azure DevOps is. But Jenkins out there is like one of the very famous, let's say, a very free available CI tool where you can just convert your projects into it, but doesn't offer any SLA. If anything fails, you do not have anyone to ask. You'll need to do a lot of Google searching and kind of do basically a lot of things out here. And I especially come from this particular background. Like I've been doing a lot of Jenkins with the starting of my career, and I've come from this particular background using Git and then Jenkins, and that's the reason I find Azure DevOps to be very easier for me, because this is something it's something that I don't need to do a lot. We used to write a lot of something known as Groovy scripts and all that stuff in order to get our things done, which used to take a lot of time. But I as such have an understanding of how Jenkins works, so it's easier for me to, let's say, implement the same practice on Azure DevOps. So we've been coming from this particular background, like most of the DevOps engineers who are right now today as an Azure DevOps engineers, especially would have come from this particular background, because when I started, there wasn't even something a service called as an Azure DevOps as such. Like I did not even know that there was a service called as VSO and Azure DevOps as such. There was Azure Cloud. Azure was running on a classic portal. We used to use Azure. We used to do a bit of AWS as such, and primarily we used to do Azure. And we were using all these tools, and then slowly moved on to something like Azure DevOps, which is, let's say, has a better SLA. Like especially you are coming from a good licensing, like the organizations would basically use, like, let's say something like a VSTS license. Like you have a lot of types of licenses out here. So organizations would especially use a professional license out here, enterprise licenses out here, and the SLA is like really good for an organization, especially the SLA is like really good. Just in case something is not working fine, you can raise a ticket with Microsoft and they will help you out within hours. That is what we feel is like the biggest advantage, or the biggest thing where Azure DevOps is like competing along with, let's say, other products in the other products in the market. And that's where I feel, or where a lot of people feel, that Azure is taking a lot of edge over AWS, because AWS doesn't have its own DevOps tool as such. AWS doesn't have a native DevOps tool. It relies upon either Azure DevOps, or it relies upon open source tools out there like Jenkins, Octopus, and all that stuff in order to implement the DevOps practices. This is where DevOps really comes into picture. You don't have to know about Chef. You don't have to know about Puppet. You don't have to know about Ansible and all that tools that are available out there. All you need to know is a tool called Azure DevOps, and you are a certified DevOps engineer. That's how simple it is. So this is what we are going to actually get into. We will look into a lot of Azure DevOps, and we'll also look at open sources when it comes to DevOps, and do a couple of projects, and I'll also show you how to do a couple of projects, and how to use the service in and out, so that it'll help you guys out. So this is just the introduction, guys. This is just like a very high level introduction of Azure DevOps as such, on what Azure DevOps is, what software development lifecycle is, and how do you manage it, and where do we come into picture, and all that stuff. So we'll look into this in great detail starting from tomorrow. So any questions that I can really take out here?
Hey, hi, Vijay here. Uh, are we
Hmm?
covering Kubernetes and Dockers here?
Yes, we are covering Kubernetes and Dockers here, but it is not going to be a traditional Docker. It's not going to be a traditional Kubernetes. It's going to be something known as AKS, Azure Kubernetes Services, and it's something going to be ACR, Azure Container Repository. So it's not going to be a traditional Docker as such, because for traditional Docker again, we'll have to, that's a different module as such. That's let's say a completely different module. That's like, Docker is like again a very big, a very big vast ocean out there. So we are going to cover Azure Container Repository and Azure Kubernetes Services, and how do you Dockerize your applications, containerize your applications, and all that stuff. Yes.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question, Vijay?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Hi,
Uh,
Glenn. Uh, what is the difference between traditional DevOps engineer and Azure DevOps engineer?
So a traditional DevOps meaning you are expected, let's say for example, I would say DevOps practice on an AWS engine. That would be traditionally meaning you'll be using for your templates, you won't be using ARM, basically you'll be using Terraform or cloud formation templates if you're coming from an AWS background. And for releases, you might not be using Azure DevOps. You might be using something like Octopus, and for code, for configuration management, you might be using something like Chef or Puppet. So there are a lot of open source tools out there that you will be leveraging, which is let's say a very traditional DevOps. Let's say basically which is a very traditional DevOps, but this is a specialization out there. So you're not dealing with open source technologies out there like Ansible, like Chef, like Puppet, and all that stuff. You'll be dealing with the native to Azure. So you are specializing in something known as an Azure DevOps. But this tool, right? This like when you go in and out to it, and when you are trying to learn something like Chef or something like Puppet, it'll be similar to what this is, because Azure DevOps is such evolved from all those products. So that is the main difference between, let's say, a DevOps engineer and an Azure DevOps engineer. Does that
The,
answer your question, Chandran?
yeah, the practices are same, right, in the traditional and Azure.
Yes, the practices are same. The traditional Azure, the practices are like really same, but the tools what you'll be using, that's different.
Okay. So by using the DevOps, Azure DevOps, we
Mhm.
can deploy the code or deliver it code to the other cloud providers like AWS and GCP.
Yes, you can. You can deploy your code to AWS or GCP also.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, Akila, you had a question.
do we have team to test our applications, our codes?
A team to test as in, I didn't get you.
I mean, we will test the coders, right? Coders
Mhm.
after coding, we will test them, right? So for
Mhm.
our applications, we will have any team or others.
Like you're talking about in here, like the demos that we're doing, or let's say
Yes.
the okay, for the demos that we're doing, we are going to basically, we do not have a team for of manual testers, but we can integrate something like an automation testing in the form of something known as Sonar Cube. So Sonar is something like a static code analyzer, an automated tester, which we can leverage in auto tester code.
Okay.
Even in real time, you'll do the same thing. I mean, the manual testing procedure is slowly getting deprecated out. You still have testers, but very limited in nature. You are also automating your test cases out here. So we'll also talk about how you test and all that stuff. Any other questions, guys?
What is Git used? It is specifically for source code management or
Yes, Git is specifically for source code management. Git basically was an open source, now purchased by Microsoft. Git is specifically an open source, and even if you go into, let's say, Azure repos, right? Even that's based out of Git. Even Azure repository is something which is based out of Git out here. If I do a file out here, this is a Git repository. This is a Git repository as such. So all the Git commands basically that can work with a GitHub repository will also work with the Azure repos. So Azure repos is nothing but another name for Git. So Git is specifically for code versioning, code management, and maintaining all your code as such. That is the primary purpose of Git. But GitHub is a publicly accessible, site out there. Like you can for free store your code and all that stuff. You also have something known as GitHub Enterprise, which is the enterprise edition of Git, where you can store all your projects in private. And if I have to draw a similarity between those two, Azure Repos is equivalent to a GitHub Enterprise, because this is a private repository. Not everyone can just directly come and look into my code into the repository that is sitting in. So it's a private repository which offers something like the CI/CD and all that stuff. So that's Git, and that's the major difference between, let's say, a GitHub and, let's say, an Azure Repos. Does that answer your question, Srikanth?
Yeah, Kiran. What is
Mhm.
Bitbucket? What is the difference between Git and Bitbucket?
So, like, different flavors out there. Like when I talk about Jenkins and when I talk about Azure DevOps, right, it's almost the same thing. That's CI tool. Now you have a lot of repositories available out there, like TFS, Team Foundation Servers, Bitbucket, Git, SVN, Subversion, that is like Subversion, and a lot of things out there. So it's just like different flavors around, available out there, different licenses available out there. It's just like they're competitors to each other. That's how you can think about. But Bitbucket at the end of the day is again source control management.
Okay. So I'm thinking that Git and Bitbucket are both like part
No,
of
no,
the
it's
same.
a different one. Like it's a different one. Bitbucket is a different one. Now, if I were to differentiate things around, I will also talk about it. So I'll put Azure Repos, Git, and Bitbucket in one side, TFS and uh, Subversion in the other side, SVN in the other side, because that's called centralized and decentralized repositories and all that stuff. We'll all talk about that in the repository classes. But yes, they are competitors to each other, products, like different products available out there. And essentially it just boils down to, let's say, one thing, that is to store your code. So where do you store your code? Is it like Git, or is it like Azure Repos? So whichever you feel that it's feasible for you, you can store your code in there.
Okay.
So any more questions, guys? Anything else? Okay, if there are no further questions, then I am going to close the session for today, and we can start with Azure Repository tomorrow, and we can look into all these things out there.
Can you share your number?
Oh yes, Sanjay, I'll do that.
Okay. And what
Just
is the major roles? What are the day-to-day roles and responsibilities of Azure DevOps that we are going to perform?
So when you talk about the roles and responsibilities, there are actually a wide variety of things that we do. So primarily configuring the CI and CD pipelines, maintaining the entire software development lifecycle as such. Yeah, and also send the number. So maintaining the software development lifecycle, maintaining the infrastructure, and making sure that everything is going in a secured way. So this is something that we'll be seeing on a daily basis right now, that what we will be doing by learning each and everything. And I'll just try to give I'll basically give the real life examples on what we do and all that stuff.
Okay. And what are the
Hmm?
links or the software we use for Azure DevOps training? So all are freeware, right? Do we need to purchase anything?
No, you don't need to purchase anything. All you need to have is, let's say, a basic license, a free license of Azure DevOps, and you don't need anything else apart from that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Like everything we need is like it's already there in that in the machine that we have. So primarily using Visual Studio Code, Visual Studios, and all these things out there. So nothing else that you need to purchase, or nothing else that you need to have, like as a software as such.
Okay. And the Visual Studio is 30 days free license, right? After that, we need to purchase if you want to
It's
continue.
a community. If you go for a community edition, then it's essentially free. Community is essentially free. You don't need to purchase a license out. If you go for professional or enterprise, that's when you need to purchase. 30 days free and then you need to purchase. But for our usage, like community edition of Visual Studio is like more than enough. Any more questions, guys? Any more questions that I can take?
So the license cost is months wise or hours wise, how it will be per Azure DevOps?
It would be a monthly license. Azure DevOps would be a monthly license depending upon the number of users basically that you want to add inside your Azure DevOps organization. So in a nutshell, yes, it's a monthly license basically that you kind of get with Azure DevOps.
Okay.
So anything else, guys, that I can take? Okay, if there are no further questions, then we are good to close the session. And yeah, we can meet tomorrow and we will discuss more on Azure DevOps and Azure repos. We'll start with Azure repos and then we'll walk our journey with Azure DevOps. So that's it from my end, guys, and have a great day ahead. We'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.